So in today's web dev tip, we're going to create an endpoint so we can actually access the stats of a particular short URL. And this really is just a case of finding an entry for a short URL in our Mongo database and just returning that object. We could refine it and just return the redirects if we need to, but we might as well return the whole object and then deal with that on the front end. So previously we've had to find out information about any of our short URLs from logging into the database, either on the terminal using the Mongo CLI or with Compass, but this will just enable us to easily see that data so we can check it in Postman, for example, but more importantly, the stats app will be able to access the endpoint to actually get the information to display a table or something to the user. So here in the redirect URL routes file, we're just going to create a new endpoint in here, and we'll put it underneath the existing one for actually getting a short URL. And it kind of makes sense to put it into this file because this is the file where we're kind of referencing a specific entry in the database. So it could go in either this one or the short URLs routing file, to be honest, but it makes sense for me to put it into here. So we're going to reference the ID in the path parameter again, as we did, so we can pick something out of the database, but we'll just put an additional path detail onto that, which is stats. So we need to access the ID of the short URL and then /stats in our request. So let's just copy this because it's going to be pretty much the same as what we've got here at the moment. So we're going to open up a new function here, and we can reuse quite a lot of the code from here. And we could possibly refactor this later on to avoid duplicate code. So maybe that's something we'll look at in a future tutorial. But this code here, where we're getting the ID and the path parameter, and also just finding the entry in the database, is exactly the same thing that we want to do here in this stats get request. And once we've got that, all we want to really do is return the result that we get. And as mentioned, we could refine this and hide some of the detail and some of the information. But for the moment, I'm just going to return res.json, which will return some JSON on the request, and then we just pass in the body. So we could do something like having a status property of OK, and then just putting the data that's another property on the object that's returned as find result. And if we do that now with an existing entry in the database, so let's just head on over to Postman, for example. So here's one that we created yesterday. So if we just on the local host, in fact, let's just use this. So instead of doing the redirect, we'll say the ID of the short URL in the database and /stats. And what we should find is we've got that status of OK in here, and then the data is the detail that's been returned from the entry in the database. And as you can see, we've got access to the redirects and all of the properties that will help us create that stats app. Okay, so that's pretty much working as we would like it. There's one thing that I'd like to just address though, and that is the case of error handling. So we haven't done really too much in terms of error handling so far in our app, but what happens if we send a request with a short URL ID that does not exist? Then we're going to get some problems. In fact, we don't get any errors in Postman, which is good, but obviously the data provided is null. So it might be a case of if we do not find a result for that particular ID in the database, we want to return some kind of different data and possibly an error code. So if the find result is good, if there's something there, we should return what we were previously returning, but if not, we'll return something else. For example, we could set a status property on the response, where we can set a HTTP status code. So we could say it's 404, for example, so there's nothing here, which might be appropriate depending on how you actually interpret a 404, but I'm just going to stick with a 400 here for a bad request. So essentially the data that's been input, which is the ID, isn't correct, but it's up to you which type of status code you respond with, but that makes sense to me here. And then we can tag on some JSON as well, so we can say the status is error, and then we can say that provide a message instead of just a null data object, and say something like no short URL with that ID exists. Okay, so now when we go back to Postman, we should find that sending the request again gives us that different response. And you can see also we've got the status code of 400. So our stats app will be able to see that and be able to interpret the status codes and also the message, and we can display that to the user. So there you go, we've got an endpoint set up to access the stats for a particular short URL. In the next tutorials, we're going to start working on the stats app itself and grabbing that information via a network request and then displaying it to the user. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.